Well, hello and welcome to podcast 4, the Sacred Path School podcast number 4. Okay, so in this podcast, I'm going to talk about the wonderful world of ethics, which obviously, or hopefully, flows on well from the visioning and values question that we addressed in the last podcast. All right. So some of the key concepts going to go through in this podcast. Oh, sorry, I should actually say thank you very much to everyone who's given feedback on the podcast so far. Thanks for your positive feedback. Really appreciate it. Just a few sort of housekeeping issues. So first of all, you can listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please take the time to do a little review, hopefully a positive review, because obviously I would like more people to listen to the podcast. If you're not on Apple, you can get the RSS feed on Buzzsprout. And you can also watch the video of the podcast on the YouTube channel, on the Sacred Path School YouTube channel. You can also connect on Facebook, so the Sacred Path School on Facebook, and also on LinkedIn. And of course, if you want to do a course, please go ahead and do a course on Thinkific. Thinkific, the Sacred Path School on Thinkific. So there's 3 courses so far on Thinkific. There's Introduction to Existentialism, which is a free half-hour intro. There's also a structured, Vision Quest program. And I've just uploaded the 8-step self-mastery challenge, which is also on there, which I highly recommend you have a look at, obviously. All right. So what I want to go through this week is key concepts. So we want to look at values and the whole idea that a value isn't a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. We want to look at whether or not people are good or bad and what your take is on that, what the implications are. Then have a look at ethics. So what's ethics? We'll have a look at normative ethical theories, ethical decision-making, and the 3 things that mess up our thinking with regard to ethical decision-making. And I should note as well that if you listen to this one, make sure you listen to the next one, because in the next one I'm going to look at why good people do bad things, which you may be aware was the subject of my PhD research and stuff that I've worked on for quite a period of time. So some of the things I'm going to tell you in this podcast, I'm going to challenge in the next one. Okay, so let's go anyway. All right. So remember in the last one we were talking about values and where you get these values from. So I just want to plant this little seed in your brain. So a value isn't a value unless you are willing to pay a price to uphold it. And generally the price that you pay is in letting go of a particular outcome. All right, so I'll come back to that, but just remember that a value isn't a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. And it comes back to the whole idea that, talk is cheap. You can talk about these things till you're blue in the face. And if you think about it in terms of the existential framework, and remember values are aspirations. So we can talk about all the values that we aspire to live by, but if our actions aren't aligned to that, then obviously they mean nothing. And I just quote Martin Luther King Jr., who civil rights activist in the 60s in America. So just a quote from him: the ultimate measure of a person, so he actually said a man, but let's update it to more relevant language, I suppose. The ultimate measure of a person is not where they stand in moments of comfort and convenience, but where they stand at times of challenge and controversy. Right, so it comes back to that whole notion of, character is revealed through challenge, and we talked a bit last time about defining moments and how defining moments basically show us what we're actually willing to do for our values, and they shape our character. So be aware of that. Like it's easy to be, you know, principled and all that sort of stuff when everything's going fine, but what actually happens when you're under the pump? So the big question, the big question here is, how do you lead a good life? And obviously the whole idea behind the Sacred Path School is about trying to share ideas and stimulate discussion and ways of looking at how you walk a sacred path through life. So how you walk a path of ascension, which obviously is the whole idea of leading a good life. And that's really the central question in the field of ethics. And with ethics, what I find is, so I've been, I suppose, studying ethics and working with ethics for probably now, I just have to have a think about this. It's over 30 years anyway. And it can be quite frustrating. I can find it quite frustrating. You see, watch the news or something like that, and you see a lot of people talking about ethics and morals and, oh, this is unethical and you're immoral and blah, 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 blah. But often those people really don't know what they're talking about. And if you go and ask them, what do you actually mean by ethics, they'll struggle to answer the question. And the reason why that is because ethics is a whole field of study which really is devoted to a question. And the question is, how do you lead a good life, or how ought we to live? Now, with ethics, you can divide the field into two areas. So one is normative ethical theory. So normative ethical theory addresses that question, that ought question. So how ought we to live? Ought, okay? And then the other field of ethics is what's called practical or empirical ethics. So it looks at what actually happens in reality. And hopefully you worked out from the stuff that we've been through so far with regards to looking at existential frameworks and those sorts of things, that big distinction between ought and actual. So big distinction between theory and reality. And I really want to dig into that. So, but we're going to start with looking at this area of normative ethical theory and the question of how ought we to live. And, you know, all of us have a framework in our minds of how we think we ought to live. And that's what we've picked up, you know, from our parents and significant others as we're growing up. So remember when we're talking about values and about digging into, you know, some of the stories or anecdotes or tales and things that you were told as a child, and what gets embedded in your psyche, you know, things around, you know, honesty is the best policy, you know, it goes around, comes around, that karmic thing, any of that sort of stuff is basically embedded in our minds, and often we'll hear, you know, when we're faced with issues, we'll hear our parents, you know, the voice of our parents recounting those sorts of stories, and that'll guide our behaviour. So all of us have a little operating, what would you call it, system, I suppose, for addressing these sorts of issues. But more often than not, people can't actually uncover or can't name what those systems or what those values or what those principles are. And that's really what we want to do with ethics, is try and pick this stuff apart. So when you're looking at ethics, when you're looking at trying to answer that question of how ought we to live, you can divide the thinking, if you like, or the theories into these sort of three subgroups, and you can divide them, or I suppose name them, by identifying three key questions, right? So the three key questions are what's right. So what's right and wrong in terms of values and principles, what's good in terms of outcomes, and what's fitting in terms of culture and context. So with the right stuff, so let's just go through this. So with the right-wrong questions, as I said, that's values and principles. And underneath that field, I suppose, are a variety of different theories. So one is what's called divine command theory. So with divine command theory, if you're trying to answer the question of what's right or wrong, and you're religious in any way, shape or form, then embodied in those religious teachings will be instructions, if you like, for how to lead a good life. So, for example, if you're Christian and you want to lead a good life, simple, follow the teachings in the Bible, and in particular the Ten Commandments. If you're Jewish, follow the teachings in the Torah. If you're Muslim, follow the teachings in the Quran. If you're Buddhist, follow the Buddhist principles to right livelihood, etc. And any spiritual or religious group will have a set of guiding principles or values that you should follow to be able to lead a good life. Okay, so it's quite straightforward. So if you want to answer the question of how to lead a good life, simple, follow the teachings. Also under that field is the teachings of Emanuel Kant. And I should point out as well, it's worthwhile noting, so remember in existentialism we talked about that the key relationship is the relationship between being and time. So understanding that over time, your state of being changes. And what I point out to you as well is that over time, the, I suppose, expectations of the world and the state of being in the world also changes. So when you're looking at different theories and philosophies, I suppose, I would suggest to you that it's worthwhile to consider the time frame or the context in which those theories came about. So obviously with religious stuff, it goes back a long, long way, thousands of years, okay? Kant, as I said, is a German school teacher in the 1860s, and essentially, and this is an oversimplification, so if you're a Kantian scholar, don't get you all upset about this, but as a simplification, basically Kant objected to the religious directives, I suppose, on how to lead a good life. And what he said instead is that what you should be looking for is universal rules. So universal rules that are applicable in every situation and that you should always follow. And when you get to ethical decision making, generally at university, and especially teaching first year students, Kant just completely does their head in, because Kant has these tests where you want to test does the rule invalidate itself? Is it applicable in every situation? Blah blah blah, and you make a decision then as to whether or not the action is acceptable or not. But the key bit that Kant was on about was, as I said, is about looking for universal rules, and Kant has really talks a lot about duty, so that you have a duty to follow those rules, and in doing so, obviously act in an ethical way. Aristotle. So Aristotle goes back obviously to the time of the Greeks. So if you think about Greeks sitting around, eating grapes, that sort of stuff. And obviously a more simple time, I would suggest you. And what Aristotle basically said was that there are a set of virtues that we can follow. And that if you want to be virtuous, then what you should be doing the whole time is enacting those virtues. And by enacting the virtues over and over and over again, it basically becomes a habit. And then out of that habit, you become an ethical or a moral person. Also, there's other principles as well underneath these three key questions, but I just want to highlight what some of the key ethical frameworks are. All right, so then under the other one, the second one, so the what's good question. So the what's good question relates to outcomes. So we're asking, the question we're asking is, what is the action which is going to create the greatest good, so the greatest number, and the least harm, so the least number. Okay, so greatest good to greatest number and least harm to least number. And again, let's consider the context. So this theory is called Utilitarianism. And so it's trying to measure utility. So utility, in sort of a simple way of explaining it, is a measure of something's worth. And utilitarian thinking basically came around Industrial Revolution times in England, and the two architects of it are John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. And so if you think about the context at the time, so Industrial Revolution time in England, so there's no issues about overpopulation, climate change, rights of civil rights, anything like that, still children are being used as chimney sweeps, those sorts of things. And the sole intention, I suppose, or focus was about empire building. So how do we build the empire as quickly as possible? And utilitarianism, in that sense, is a very logical, mathematical way of trying to work out what the best outcome is. So essentially look at all the different possibilities, all the different impacts of the outcomes, and as I said, then you make an assessment as to which outcome provides the greatest good to the greatest number and the least harm to the least number. The third question is what's fitting. So this is the culture question. So this is culture and context, and this theory is ethical relativism. And if you want an anecdote for this, it's when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So the classic example is, okay, so in Australia it's wrong to pay bribes, but if I'm in an African country or something like that, where it's commonplace to pay bribes, is it okay to pay bribes? So from an ethical relativism perspective, you'd say, yeah, that's fine. Now, as I said, there's other theories as well. There's feminine ethics. There's Confucian ethics. There's all these other ways of answering that question of how ought we to live. But again, it's worthwhile to understand a simple framework, I suppose, of how we answer that question, those three key questions. Excuse me. So what's right in terms of values and principles? What's good in terms of outcomes? And what's fitting in terms of culture and context? Now, what makes ethics difficult is the fact that the answer to these three questions often doesn't coincide. Like the easy ethical questions are the black and white ones, like somebody cuts you off in traffic and starts yelling at you, should you get out of your car and go over and kill them? Well, obviously the answer is no. Like, it's a very black and white sort of question. The difficult ethical questions are the shades of grey questions, where, as I said, the answer to these three key questions doesn't necessarily coincide. And a simple example for that is to look at some of these childhood stories, fairy tales and childhood stories that we grow up in, and grow up with, not grow up in. And I always liked, when you had these stories and you get to the end of the story, and the narrator will say, and the moral of the story is blah, blah, blah. So see how morals relate to values and principles, and about, that it's, again, it's right to tell the truth, like right to stick up for your mates, etc., etc., etc. But let's just think about one of them to start off with. So take the story of Robin Hood. So Robin Hood, most of us know the story of Robin Hood. So Robin Hood, in England, medieval times, people get around in tights and those sorts of things. And if you want to see a bad movie, watch the Robin Hood movie with Russell Crowe. But anyway, so Robin Hood robbed from the rich to give to the poor. So your first question is, was this right or wrong? Right? And if you ask this question in a group of people, like a workshop or something like that, straight away someone will say, no, well, it was right because the noble people were lording over the poor people and the peasants, and they were all suffering. So what he did was right. So I say, hang on a minute. Just before we jump to that conclusion, let's pull apart our thinking, because what you're talking about, what you're considering there, is the action from an outcome perspective. Let's just consider it from a values or principle perspective. So was it right or wrong? So Robin Hood was stealing. And what we want to know, is it right or wrong to steal? So let's go back to some of those frameworks, and you, like I said, you can go through the 10 Commandments, etc. Is it right or wrong to steal? Obviously, it's wrong to steal. It's wrong to take somebody else's stuff. So with regard to that question, big cross, okay? The second question, was it a good outcome? So remember here, what we're trying to do is work out greatest good to greatest number, least harm to least number. All right, so he robbed from the rich, so a small number of people, and gave to the poor, distributed it to a lot of people. So was it a good outcome in terms of greatest good to greatest number, least harm to least number? Answer, yes. So big tick with that one. Then the third question is, was it contextually fitting? So in other words, in the context of the events of the time, what was going on, the key question I suppose to ask there is, did they deserve it? So did the rich people deserve to be stolen from? And the evidence is that they were treating the people very badly, being very greedy, etc. And so arguably you could say the answer is yes, it was contextually fitting. They did deserve to be stolen from, so it was okay. So you see out of those three questions, one of them, cross, so it was wrong to steal, but it was a good outcome and it was contextually fitting. So you get 2 ticks, 1 cross. And so the result of that, right, so the result of that, 2 versus 1, is that when we think about the story of Robin Hood, or when we watch the story of Robin Hood on, a movie or read a book or something like that, Robin Hood becomes the hero. Right, so the way that we justify the events, right, the way that we justify the events changes the meaning of the events. So because we were able to justify why what Robin Hood was doing was okay, we end up lauding a thief as a hero. Right, so the thief, Robin Hood, becomes the hero in those stories. And the bad guy in those stories is the Sheriff of Nottingham. And all the Sheriff of Nottingham is doing is trying to uphold the law. But as I said, he becomes the bad guy. All right, so remember that. Remember the central question of ethics, how ought we to live, the 3 feeder questions. So is it right? So what's right? What's good outcome? And what's fitting? And ethics, the shades of grey questions are about the interaction between those 3 questions. And if you're watching the video of this on YouTube, you'll see there's a picture of someone juggling, so juggling 3 balls. And that's a really good analogy for ethics because you're juggling those 3 questions, so good, right, fitting, but you've obviously only got 2 hands, so you've got to juggle the 3 balls. And as I said, that's a good analogy. So why has ethics come up so much now? And I mean in this sort of period of time in humanity. So I would say in sort of the last sort of 10, 20 years. And the reason is because with that question of what's contextually or culturally fitting, if you go back, let's say, if we go back, as I said, 20 or 30 years, then there was not so much intense interaction between the different cultures on the planet. And the internet, globalization, and all of that has basically meant that we've got this clash of cultures. So we're starting to question, things like, probably the terrible example, but unfortunately it's quite relevant, is for example, the Japanese culture of killing whales or killing dolphins. And the argument is, it's part of our culture to be able to do that. And if we look at it from somewhere like Australia or America or UK or whatever, we look at that and go, but that's completely wrong. And so see how we're looking at it from the perspective of the right-wrong question, so the values and principles, and from a Japanese perspective, they're looking at it from what's culturally fitting. There's other horrible examples, of course, from Africa, for example. There's different cultures who do weird things like, whipping women as part of a rites of passage, these sorts of things, right? So those types of actions, I suppose, sort of, what would you call them, sort of historical cultural practices are having the light shone on them, and different cultures that maybe have moved on from that sort of stuff are questioning those sorts of things. And obviously other things like treatment of women, etc., etc., etc. The other thing to note with this is that the question of, so remember again with the existential stuff, that key relationship between being and time. So with regard to being and time, the thing that changes quite dramatically is the cultural stuff. So you've only got to think back maybe say 50 years, where are we, 2022, maybe we'll go back a little bit more than that. So if we go back to sort of the 1950s, so if you imagine that you went to a popular beach now and scooped up a group of scantily clad men and women and dropped them back into the 1950s and put them on the same beach, dressed in the same way, they would pretty much be immediately arrested, for what would you call it, public indecency or something like that. Right? But of course, these days we think nothing of it. Same things with some sort of culturally acceptable things like smoking cigarettes. So I remember when I started working a long time ago, so back in, when was that? Let me think about this, hang on. So back in the 1980s, I was working at I was on a graduate program at one of the major banks here in Australia, and we worked in an open plan office. So it was when open planning was all the rage. And everybody had a ashtray on their desk, and many people just sat there puffing away, smoking cigarettes. And I remember as time went on, and obviously some people started to object to it. I remember when they brought in a ban of saying that you can't smoke cigarettes in lifts, because people used to get into a lift with a cigarette, and obviously if you don't smoke, you're stuck in this lift with somebody smoking cigarettes. Right, see how time has moved on. Same thing, you used to be able to smoke in aeroplanes. So the back half of the aeroplane used to be the smoking section, and if you're in the first half of the plane and you wanted to go to the toilet, for example, you had to like go down through the wall of smoke to get to the toilet. So if you tell kids these stories these days, they shake their head and go, "That's ridiculous. How could that ever happen?" But the point that I'm trying to make is that over time, what we see as being culturally acceptable changes, right? And probably a more recent example of that is same-sex marriage. So again, if you go back, well, you don't have to go back very far at all. Maybe only go back 20 years, and it was seen as totally unacceptable. But these days, obviously, it's very acceptable, and it's acceptable on the basis of equal rights. So see how we get back to the what's right or wrong. So the principle there is equality, and that influences the culture. So now let's just think about how these three areas of thought interact. And a good analogy to use here is the analogy of a train. So imagine a train that's heading into the future, right? So a train's heading into the future. At the front of the train is all the right, wrong people, okay? So right, wrong thinking. At the back of the train, so usually in the club car, smoking, these big fat stogie cigars, doing deals and that, are the utilitarians, so the outcome-based people. And in the middle of the train are the context and cultural people, okay? Now, at the people at the front of the train, they're the ones that are fighting for ideals. And remember what I just said a minute ago about a value isn't a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. So people that are out there fighting for the rights of whales, climate change, transgender rights, anything like that, they're right at the front of the train, and they're fighting for their ideals, right? The idealists. But also at the front of the train are the fundamentalists. So the people that are willing to pay the ultimate price to uphold their beliefs. And obviously the worst example of that would be somebody who's like a suicide bomber or something like that, obviously deluded into willing to pay that sort of price, right? Now, as I said, at the back of the train, in the club car, they're the utilitarians. So utilitarians are doing the deals. Oh, if we do this, then that'll happen, that'll happen. So you're trying to actually work out, or they're trying to work out, greatest good for greatest number, least harm for least number, and you're offsetting things. Then in the middle of the train, as I said, are the cultural and context people. And basically the whole time, the groups at the front and the groups at the back are agitating the ones in the middle to determine what is seen as being acceptable from a cultural or contextual perspective. And again, the same-sex marriage debate, when that was going on, was a very good example of how that works. So the people at the front of the train were basically agitating for equality, etc. The people at the back of the train were going, well, if we do this, then that's going to happen, we don't know, okay? But the point is that culture and context shifts over a period of time and is influenced by things that have happened before and the agitation that is going on now with regard to the idealists. We should also note as well that, again, just to reiterate that question of value isn't a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it. So there's also a couple of other quotes there. John Paul Mellencamp, if we don't stand for something, we'll fall for anything. Right? So there's a trade-off here. So if we're not clear about what our values are, and we're not clear about what's most important in our lives, then we can very, very easily and very, very quickly get caught up in either what's culturally acceptable, it's acceptable to pay bribes, treat women badly, whatever, or we can get caught up in the, the deal making. Oh, if we do this, that, the utilitarian type thinking. And the other quote's worthwhile noting there is the only thing needed for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Right? So note again how this drives back into action. So you've got to take action around this sort of stuff, and it's not enough just to talk about it. Remember again with regard to values, so just to pick up again on the value stuff. So remember the head, heart, hand analogy with values. So values are based in the head where we're intellectually convinced of something. Right? So if you think about the idea of freedom, right? So based in the head where we're intellectually convinced that it's a good idea to uphold the value of freedom. Based in the heart where we're affected by something's worthwhileness. So think about freedom. So think about how we feel, or how you feel, when your freedom is taken away from you, where somebody tries to restrict your freedom or control you in some way. It creates that real agitation, the energy around it. And then the last thing, so based in the hand, where values commit us to decision and action. So again, you've got to be able to do something about it. It's not enough to talk about it, you've got to do something about it. So then with these three areas, what is an ethical dilemma? Okay, because again, you hear a lot of people talk about, oh, it's an ethical dilemma, blah, blah, but what is it? So ethical problems deal with actions and their consequences in regard to how we as humans relate to our environment. Okay, so action and consequences and how we relate to our environment. So generally, and again, just to reiterate, so we're not talking about black and white things here, we're talking about shades of grey where you've got different options. So ethical problems generally provide us with a choice of actions which will result in a range of different consequences. And we'll go through some examples in a minute. At the core of ethics are our principles and values, and it's these which we use to evaluate the relative merits of each action and the different consequences. So this is why there is great benefit in taking some time to think about what your values are, so what you see as being most important in your life, and what you've actually done about it. And again, the test there is to look at the defining moments question. So in those defining moments, in those times of conflict and challenge, how did you actually act, and what does that tell you about who you are? What does that tell you about your character? And then, as we've said before, that has implications or ramifications for what's going to happen next. What makes ethical problems difficult is that values come into conflict, and then we need to make value judgments according to which values are most important to the individual. So remember the example that I gave about being in the last podcast about being in Nazi Germany. Your Jewish neighbours come to you, knock on your door, say, look, the SS is in the area, can we hide in your attic? So you make a decision, yes, go right ahead, because they're friends of yours, and you value the value of friendship, empathy, compassion, etc. A little bit of time passes by, SS comes around, bangs on your door, bang, 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 looks at you, says, do you have any Jews hiding in your attic? And of course, straight away you lie, and you say, no, of course we don't. Right? So you're valuing the value of respect for life higher than the value of honesty. And the potential price that you pay for upholding that value could be that if you get found out, so if they find that you are lying, you and your family may also be arrested and thrown in jail or something like that. See, so that's what makes it, you have to take a little deep breath. It's a bit of a challenge because there's a potential you get into a lot of trouble. But you're willing to pay the price to uphold your value. If you're not willing to pay the price, it's just talk. So the SS come around and say, have you got any Jews hiding in your attic? Say, yeah, oh yeah, they're up there. Good on you. You don't value respect for life at all. So the best solution to an ethical problem will involve upholding those values to the greatest extent possible whilst violating the least number possible. Okay, so violating the least number possible. And generally, the best solution will be one that you can both justify and recommend, right? So when somebody comes to you and says, why did you do that? You can say, well, I did it because blah, 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 blah. I believe in the value of respect for life, etc. And I recommend that in the same situation, you do exactly the same thing, right? So see how, and again, we'll come back to this, but see how you're trying to align your actions with your intentions. So with that past, present, future model, so in the future, you've got your intentions or aspirations. In the present, you've got your actions. And in the past, you've got your justifications or stories. So we want to make sure all three of those line up. Now, when it comes to resolving ethical dilemmas, the model that has been used that underpins the majority of the research which has been done into ethics is what's called the Jones moral intensity model. And essentially what that model says is we step through these steps. So the first step is we recognize the moral issue, right? So we recognize the moral issue. The next step is we make a moral judgment, right? So we make a moral judgment using one of those frameworks. So we think about what we've been taught about what's right and wrong by our parents or our church or our teachers, our school, anything like that. Or possibly we use utilitarian type thinking. And I'd suggest to you that the dominant way of thinking that we default into these days is utilitarian, because we're very much trained to look at utility, and the measure of utility in our society, in Western society, is money. Right? So if you think about, where should we put a hospital? Should we put it in this suburb or that suburb? It's utilitarian thinking that really drives it. Greatest good for greatest number, least harm for least number. And the way that we're measuring utility is often in money. The third step is we establish moral intent. So after we've done our little thinking about what's right or wrong or what's fitting or what's a good outcome, then we establish moral intent. And then the last bit is we engage in moral behaviour. And the other bit that comes into it is what's called moral intensity. So what that says is that if it's a really big issue, we're going to pay more attention to it than a small issue. So if it's something like, I don't know, $5 million fraud or potential where, somebody's going to get harmed or something like that, then we're going to pay much more attention to it than a very small issue like, pinching the office stationery or something like that. Now, if you sit in a workshop like I do and you ask people, okay, is that the way you make ethical decisions? Pretty much everybody will go, yep, that's exactly how I make ethical decisions, right? So they'll say, yep, I recognise the issue. Yeah, I think about what's right and wrong. My parents taught me, etc. I establish my intent, and then, yep, I go and do it. All right. But as I said, what happens, or what often happens, is that people are unable to pull apart their thinking. And so the more complex these issues get, and as I said, they're getting more complex because of the clash of cultures, globalization, internet, all that sort of stuff. The more complex issues get, the less able people are to actually make decisions. And often people make decisions and then with the benefit of hindsight want to change their decisions. So what I would suggest to you is that before you jump to a conclusion about any ethical issue, and as I said, bear this in mind that I'm going to do the next podcast is going to look at why good people do bad things. So I'm going to challenge some of these things that we've been talking about, right? But before you jump to a conclusion, what I would suggest to you is that when you are alerted to the fact that you're facing some sort of ethical dilemma, what I strongly recommend you do is get a big piece of paper and just actually do a bit of a brain dump to try and get some information on the page before you start trying to make ethical decision. And the 4 questions that you should ask are, number 1, who are the players? So in other words, who are the parties involved in this issue? Right, so it could be, and again, I probably should have had an example to go through this, but you can think about like who's involved. So the people that are directly involved, who else does it affect? Does it affect society, organisations, whatever? So who are the players? Number 2, what are their rights? Right, so what are their rights? So see how we're going into right, wrong stuff. So what are their rights? They have a right to freedom, etc. Actually, I'll give you a good example. A good example is ethical dilemma is it okay for gambling companies to advertise gambling during sports broadcasts? So, soccer or tennis or whatever. Is it okay for gambling to advertise that? And so you could say, who are the players? So the players are, for example, the people watching the broadcast, obviously the gambling company, obviously the broadcaster themselves, the sport, etc., etc. And then you go through what are their rights. And the thing that comes up with this, with regard to what are their rights. So an organisation has a right to make a profit, trade freely, etc., etc. People watching the broadcast have a right to information, etc. And the one that sort of throws the spanner in the works here is with regard to children. So what rights do children have? So children have special rights to be protected in our society. And when it comes down to gambling, there's plenty of research that shows that gambling can have very negative effects. And so the argument is that children have a right to be protected from being exposed to the whole concept of gambling and the influence that it has on their the way they view sport, etc. The third question is, what are their responsibilities? So for each of those players, you work out what responsibilities they have. And again, see here you say, so the broadcaster has a responsibility not to have a negative impact on children, for example. And then number 4, what are the risks to each party? So basically you get all that information down on the page without jumping to a conclusion or trying not to jump to a conclusion. And then you would go through and try and use those different ethical theories. So the is it a good question, or is it right, or is it fitting, to try and determine what a good outcome would be and what the implications of that outcome are. In terms of working through this, so there's lots of different ethical decision-making models. And if you work, particularly in a public sector organisation, you'll find that generally the public sector will tell you how they want you to make decisions. They'll say, when you're faced with an ethical decision, excuse me, when you're faced with an ethical dilemma, you should work through this particular ethical decision-making model. So see how it's very rational, logical, I would even suggest to you mechanical. So for me, I put together a model called the Believe It model. Right. So when you're faced with an ethical dilemma, you should go through these steps. So and the Believe It, what do you call it? It's a not an anecdote, whatever the word is for a simplification. So anyway, B stands for background. So before you jump into it, you should consider what the background has been. And I'll go into that a bit more, because what happens with ethical dilemmas is ethical dilemmas don't happen suddenly. They happen gradually and then suddenly. So there'll be a whole lot of background stuff that's gone on before, and you should consider that, not just consider the issue in isolation. So what's the background? E is estimate. So you make an initial estimation of what your take on it is. And this is where you might use those 3 questions. So what's right, what's good, what's fitting? Okay. L is list, so you list off those possible actions. I is impact, so you consider what's the impact of the different options. E is eliminate, so if there's any ones that's going to create a very negative impact, so someone's going to die or something like that, then you eliminate those. V is values, so you consider which values have been upheld or violated by the different options. And then E is evaluate, so you evaluate the whichever action you think is best. And it's the believe it model, because you might be questioned by somebody and said, I can't believe you did that, and you say to them, well, you better believe it, I did it because blah 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 blah. So you see how you want to justify and recommend. So I did it because blah 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 blah, and I recommend in the same situation you do exactly the same thing. All right, so it seems pretty logical and rational at this point. So let's actually do a little test. All right. And I should note as well. Sorry, I missed a little bit here. I should note as well. So we talk when we're talking about existential philosophy and the existential model. Then remember, as we were going through it, I was saying to you, it's worthwhile asking these little questions, because there's various questions like, what's your belief in free will versus destiny, etc. Because that forms little foundations. These assumptions form the foundations that then underpin the house that you're building. So one of the key questions you've got to ask with regard to ethics, and this is going to go back to your take on how the world works, is do you believe people, or human nature, so do you believe people are inherently good or bad? Right? So do you believe people are inherently good or bad? See, whichever way around you fall in that question is going to have really major implications for how you interact with the world. Because, for example, if you believe people are inherently bad, then you will assume, for example, that people are going to do bad things, and your take on ethics will be very much around the whole notion of wanting to have oversight, control, government control, etc., etc. But if you believe people are inherently good, then you would desire sort of less government control, less oversight from police and things like that, because you have a belief in human nature as being good. Right, so it's worthwhile asking that question as well, because again, it's going to have big implications, right? The second question to ask is with regard to yourself. So, are you a good moral person? And most people will say, well, of course I am, right? And even the people that are bad, especially in a workshop, are going to lie anyway, because they're bad people. So they're going to lie because by definition they're bad. So bad people lie, don't tell the truth, etc. Okay. And the question is, so if you believe you're a good moral person, how do you know that? And so hence that's the defining moments question, etc. So if you have the story in your head about you're a good moral person, you say, how do you know that? I know that because in this situation I did that. I've been tested through time. So I stood up for my friends. I told the truth. I don't steal. See how you have like a whole what would you call it, like a plethora of examples to pattern match against with the past. But if you've done bad things, you might pattern match against those things as well, and then that's going to have implications for how you believe, about yourself, about what's possible with yourself. And if you start telling that story about that you're a bad person, so remember that the brain always wants to be right. Okay, so if you start telling a story about you're a bad person, then even though that story is negative for you, because obviously if you're telling a story that you're a bad person, that has negative implications for yourself, but your brain is going to pattern match against all the evidence that supports the fact, that supports the story that you've already told yourself. Does that make sense? So if you tell yourself you're a bad person, you're pattern matching against all the examples to prove to yourself that you're a bad person, even though that story is negative for yourself. So you're going to, when you're reflecting on your past, you're going to highlight and pay more attention to all the evidence that supports that story, and you're going to dismiss any evidence that supports the fact that you're not a bad person. And as I said, that has very major implications for how you then behave. Because if you're telling a story that you're a bad person when you're looking at a situation, an ethical situation in the present moment, and remember that a value isn't a value unless you're willing to pay a price to uphold it, right? And the price generally is a desired outcome. So if you tell the story that you're a bad person, you're going to be more likely to perpetrate bad actions, steal things, etc. Because you go, well, I'm a bad person, what do you expect? See how this works and see how fluid this is. All right, so let's test it. So let's assume you're a good moral person. You know you're a good moral person because you've got a whole lot of examples from the past where you have stood up for your values, etc. And you have clarified your values, by going through values clarification exercise. And if you haven't done that, you can have a look at a good example is the Rockage Values Survey, which is ROKEACH, so Rockage Values Survey. Google it, you can find that. And you can go through that activity, And also note the quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald, so character is action. Okay, so character is action. So you see how you can talk about all the stuff to you blue in the face, but the reality is that character is action. All right, let's do the test, right? So here's the first dilemma. And so this is a classic dilemma that's used in ethical research. So when researchers, PhD researchers, university researchers trying to research ethics, they'll take people, put them in a room, etc. And they'll often use this. So this is called the Trolley Dilemma. And if you want a graphic illustration of the Trolley Dilemma, Google, go on YouTube and look for what's it called? The Good Place, the Netflix series, The Good Place Trolley Dilemma, and you can see a graphic illustration of this. Anyway, so here's the question. So you are in the control room for a mine and you see a fully laden boxcar coming down the tracks out of control. It's going to hit 3 people and kill them. There is a junction ahead. If you pull a lever, you can divert the boxcar, but it will kill 1 person instead. What do you do? All right. So when I do this in like a workshop with people, you give them a short space of time to think about it, literally 2 seconds. And most people will either go, yeah, pull the lever, or far out, no idea, going to do nothing, right? So people are either going to act straight away or they're going to freeze. And when you say, why did you make that decision? They say, well, it's 3 people versus 1, so 1 person's going to die. Okay, so that's utilitarian thinking. So utilitarian thinking is, remember, greatest good to greatest number, least harm to least number. So obviously 3 versus 1, 1's going to die. If you were very universalist in your thinking, so remember universalism relates to what's right or wrong, so values or principles. So you might have a principle along the lines of do no harm, right? So when it comes to this situation, people that are particularly universalist go, no, I can't do anything because I don't want to do any harm, right? Anyway, so that's the first one. So let's change it a bit. So here's the second one. So you are standing on an overpass in a mine. You look down and see a fully laden boxcar coming down the tracks out of control. It's going to hit 3 people and kill them. There's a person standing in front of you. If you push them over, they will fall onto the tracks and stop the boxcar, saving the people, but it will kill them instead. What do you do? All right, so same thing, think about it. What would you do? And what happens when you get to this question is all the people, actually I shouldn't say all people because there's usually some who say they're still going to push the person, right? But the majority of the people go, no, I'm going to do nothing. And you go back to them and say, wait a minute, why are you going to do nothing? The equation is still the same. So it's still 3 versus 1. So 3 people going to die, or push them over, 1 person's going to die. So what's changed? And what's changed here is the fact that you need to make contact with another person. So you see how in the first instance, all you got to do is pull a lever. So pull a lever, press a button, whatever. But in the second one, you've actually got to make contact with the person. So when it gets to making contact, people that freak out and go, can't do it, okay? So the first thing that completely mucks up your logical, rational thinking with regard to ethical decision-making is what's called the contact principle. And it has pretty major implications for the way that we are living these days, and in particular, the way we are living so virtually. So the rise of the internet, working virtually, not having contact with people. So that's why it's easy for someone to get online and start vilifying somebody else, bullying them, whatever, because they're not an actual person sitting in front of them. They're just someone who's online, right? So it changes the way that you think about it. So here's the third dilemma. So the third dilemma. So you're in the control room for a mine. You see a fully laden boxcar coming down the tracks out of control. It's going to hit 3 people that you don't know and kill them. There is a junction ahead. If you pull a lever, you can divert the boxcar, but it will kill 1 person that you do know, and you like them, by the way. What do you do now? Now, so imagine that the 1 person is your mother, your nana, your daughter, your partner, something like that. And what happens with this is most people go, no, bad luck, not doing anything. My loved one is living and the rest of you can die. And it doesn't actually matter if it was, 50 people instead of 3 people. Often they'll still go, no, sorry, still my loved one's going to live. And so the second principle that mucks up our rational, logical thinking around ethical dilemmas is what's called, is the personal versus impersonal principle. So if it's personal, it changes the way we think about it, right? It changes the way we think about it. So you see how it becomes emotive now? So it's not like logical, rational, so you can't go 3 versus 1 or 10 versus 1. You go, not bad luck, it's somebody that I love, they're living, you're dying. All right, so see how I'm challenging the way that you think about ethical dilemmas, so it's not rational and logical. Let's keep going. So I'll give another example. So here's example 4. So you buy a coffee from the cafe on the way to work, you pay for it with a $10 note, person gives you change for a 20, what do? So most of us are going to go, hey, sorry, you just gave me the wrong change, I only gave you a 10. So most of us are going to be honest there, so see the principle of honesty. But let's shake it up a bit, okay? So here's the next example. So imagine yesterday you bought a coffee from the cafe on the way to work. You're in a hurry because you're running late, and when you got to work, you took a sip and realised it was lukewarm, and you go, oh, far out, horrible, you had to chuck it out, you hate lukewarm coffee. This morning you're in a bad mood, you've been up half the night with a sick child, or you've been sick yourself, whatever. You had a bad drive to work, you're running late for a meeting, you need a good strong coffee to get your brain working, you go to the cafe, and you explain to them what happened yesterday, expecting that they're going to go, oh, far out, we're so sorry, and give you a free coffee. But instead of that happening, they question your attitude and your honesty and they question your honesty and start giving you attitude, that's what I'm trying to say. And so now you pay for your new coffee with a $10 note and the person gives you change for 20, what do you do now? So most of us are going to say, what would you do? Most of us are going to say, oh, we're going to give them the money. But most of us are going to acknowledge that in that scenario, we're going to be more tempted to keep the money. Now, remember that the important thing to drill into here is what's your justification for it? And mostly when you ask people, what's your justification for keeping the money? They'll say, well, goes around, comes around. See, karma. Goes around, comes around, they deserve it. They just treated me badly, they gave me attitude, so therefore I'm going to keep their money. So see how that, right? So the third principle that mucks up your thinking around this is what is called history matters, right? So you can't look at ethical dilemmas in isolation. You need to consider what's gone on before, and you need to recognize that what's gone on before changes the way you think about events. So you see how we're going around this little existential model again? We're going round and round and round. So everything that happens before affects what happens next. So if something bad has happened before, it's going to affect the way that you think about this. All right, so let's keep going. So this is number 6. So as you're parking your car in a busy and very crowded parking garage, you turn into a small space and you accidentally scrape the side of the car next to you. It's only a small scrape along the door, and you can see from the logo on the car it's a company car anyway. Nobody's seen you do it. What do you do now? And most people like joke around and go, check for CCTV cameras and then move the car, right? But the reality is that most of us are going to leave a note. Far out, sorry, dent your car, please contact me, we'll sort it out, okay? So let's go to the next one. So this is number 7. So this is part 2. So after the last incident, excuse me, after the last incident, you left a note on the car and the company secretary contacted you thanking you for your honesty and saying that he would get a quote to fix the car and have it sent to you. A week later, you received the quote in the mail. Your expectation has been no more than a couple of $100. But to your horror, you open the letter and you find 2 pages detailing a long list of repairs and a bill of $1,500. So you're pretty annoyed about it. You didn't take a photo at the time, so you have no choice but to hand the matter over to your insurer. You have long-term consequences for your premium. So you're pretty annoyed about what's happened and it cost you money, right? Pain. Several months later, you're running late for a meeting again. You're parking your car in another garage and you do exactly the same thing. What do you do now? And again, most people will acknowledge that history matters. So what's happened before will affect the way you think about it now. So the fact that before you got dudded by the other people, and see how again this also relates to that question of whether or not you believe human nature is good or bad. Okay, because obviously if you believe it's bad, you say, well, therefore I'm justified to do X, move my car. Okay. Then the next example. So let's put all those principles together. So the next example. So you're the regional manager for an Australian construction company. And for the last 2 years, you've been trying to break into the Egyptian construction market. You've recently tendered for a $300 million project and have been invited to a final meeting over lunch with a local consultant. And over lunch, the consultant tells you that it's down to your firm and one other. The other firm is offering a large business facilitation fee, which is common practice in Egypt. If you match their fee, you'll get the work. What do you do now? Right? And bear in mind that there's no contact required, so you don't have to give them a bag of cash or anything like that, right? And you can just authorize the, they're going to give you an invoice for business facilitation, and you just have to authorize it with accounts. And often people will say, yeah, fine, authorize it, or they'll say, oh, I don't know, okay? But let's just shake it up a little bit. So this is example 9. So same scenario as part 1, however, note the following. So let's make it a bit more spicy. So you know that next month the board is meeting in Australia to reassess the Egypt strategy, and if there's no new business, it's highly likely the Egypt operation will be closed down. And if this happens, 35 Australians will lose their jobs. Many of these are friends of yours and have relocated to Egypt with their families and your request. What do you do now? So see how we've made it personal? Right? And at this point, most people acknowledge that, oh, far out. Yeah, I'd be more likely to pay the money. And then the last one, so this is the last scenario. So same scenario, note the following. The board in Australia is going to meet to reassess the Egypt strategy, but you also know that business in Australia is bad. And so it's highly likely you will also lose your job. And this is problematic as your partner has cancer and needs ongoing expensive medical care. And you also know that the other firm in contention is a New Zealand firm run by an arch rival of yours that you have had numerous run-ins with before. What do you do now? So see, now it's personal. It personally affects you, affects your partner, affects the 35 Australians, right? You also have a personal historical relationship with the rival firm. And as I said, there's no contact required because you just have to authorise it. So most people at this point will acknowledge that they'll be more likely to pay the bribe. And see again, the important relationship to dig into is the justification. So there'll be a whole lot of justifications. Well, I have to look after my friends, I have to look after myself, I have to look after my wife or partner, plus this other asshole in New Zealand's done it, and everybody else is doing it. It's common practice in Egypt, so what's your flipping problem? All right, so see how you can justify the bad behaviour. But see how it's no longer that rational, logical process that we talked about at the start. So those three things that can influence your thinking and muck it up. So contact versus no contact, personal versus impersonal, and history matters. Okay, now I just want to finish off here. And as I said, I'm going to come back to this in the next podcast and look at, okay, so why do good people do bad things? Because that was where I got to with it. And as I said, I'll explain that to you in the next podcast. But let's just clarify here. So what's the importance of shared values? Right? And the importance of shared values is really about organisations. And in organisations can be anything from a work organisation to a social group to a sports group or whatever. And the key issue here is trust, right? Trust. And so so the definition of trust is to commit the safety of something with confidence to a person or to allow a person to do some action with the expectation of safety or without fear of the consequences. So with shared values, what you're trying to do is get on the same page with other people so you can generate trust, so you can feel safe to do things. And Charles Handy wrote a book called The Hungry Spirit in 1999, and he outlined 7 cardinal principles of trust, which I think is worthwhile just going through now. So 1, trust is not blind. So it's unwise to trust people whom you do not know well, you have not observed in action over time, and who are committed to the same goal. So see that history matters, right? History matters. 2, trust needs boundaries. So unlimited trust is in practice unrealistic. Trust requires constant learning. So see that whole circular feedback loops, etc., etc., etc. Trust is tough, but like glass, once broken, it can never be the same again. So think about those instances, where somebody's dudded you and they've lied to you, shafted you, whatever, and they've broken your trust. It's very, very hard to rebuild trust. Trust needs bonding. So see that has the personal versus impersonal, and that's the reason why in teams, etc., they do all this team building exercise. You're trying to bond people together. Have shared experiences. Trust needs touch. So again, that's the personal stuff. And trust has to be earned. And generally what I would say is that when we meet somebody for the first time, we give them the benefit of the doubt. Or if we're a cynic, we give them enough rope to hang themselves. And then basically what we do is we watch them and we check in whether or not their actions are aligned to their words. All right, so trust is in essence an attitude, and if you want the attitude to prevail, this is in organisations again, you need these 4 conditions to be satisfied. So the behaviour must be distinct. So the actions taken to support values must be clear and distinct. The behaviour must be consistent over time. So see how we're back to that relationship between being and time? Right? And history matters. So we want to know that over a period of time, I know I can trust that person because they've stood by me through thick and thin. And see how we're back to the Martin Luther King quote, right? So, about knowing people in times of challenge and controversy. 3, behaviour must be consistent in different situations, right? So it's no good if a person treats somebody in one particular situation, so in work, out of work, etc., etc., different divisions or different social groups. So people need to be consistent. And 4, there needs to be consensus that the attitude is correct. So consensus. See, so we often, if we're wanting to know about somebody else, we check in with somebody else that we know and see whether or not they agree with us. So is there consensus? And just to note as well, so with regard to organisations, so basically what the research shows in organisations that people don't pay attention to the stated values of the organisation. What they see as being the real values in an organisation are demonstrated by 2 things. So 1 is the behaviour of leaders in the organisation, right? So leaders can't say one thing and do another. They need to be consistent. And secondly, whatever behaviour is recognised and rewarded. right? Whatever behavior is recognized and rewarded. So you've got to make sure that the rewards are actually aligned to the aspirational values, right? And just finish off like, how does this relate back to the existential model? So the past, present, future model. And I just want to reiterate, so remember over in the future, what you've got is the aspirational being. So dreams, visions, and your values live in the future. So your values are aspirational. In the present moment is the actions. And remember again that you need to be able to do practices that allow you to be as present as possible, because if you miss the opportunity, you don't have the opportunity to exercise your power through being able to choose. And in the past is the constructed being. So this is the stories. So this relationship, this is intentions, actions, justifications. And that's the relationship that we're going to dig into in the next podcast when we look at why good people do bad things. All right. So I hope you found that useful. I'm going to leave it there. And thank you very much for tuning into the podcast. Bye for now.